This is the story of how my phobia of flying started and how I overcame it for good. Some people say that we are born with the fear of loud noises and the fear of falling, and everything else we learn. So press pause, grab a cup of tea and a biscuit or cake and buckle up for this tale of blood, sweat and tears. Actually, it's none of that. It's just me telling you simply how I overcame my flight phobia. My first commercial flight, well in fact any flight, was in June 1986 when my best friend Darren and I decided to go to Corfu on holiday. I was very excited as a single 21-year-old to be going on an airliner and on holiday with my mate Darren. The day arrived and we travelled to Manchester Airport nice and early to catch our flight. I was still excited and wasn't nervous or anxious about the upcoming flight and was just thinking about getting to Corfu and being on holiday. I can't remember worrying or having any negative thoughts about flying. My dad had explained the principles of flight many times to me as an ex-RAF engineer. I now know that the same flight to the same destination from the same airport in the same type of aircraft, a Boeing 737, had caught fire due to an uncontained engine fire before taking off in August 1985, a year earlier, tragically with the loss of 55 souls. The word soul, used in that context, always reminds me of those mafia films where the phrases dead man walking or he's dead already but just doesn't know it yet are used on a regular basis. I'm not exactly sure why, it just does. Apparently the phrase was derived from the marine industry where this was commonly used. That's the souls on board phrase, not the dead already phrase. It was a term that comprehensively covered everyone on board in whatever capacity. I'm not sure why they couldn't just say we have 200 people in total on board or simply persons on board. In fact, general aviation does use persons on board and more often the acronym of POB. It's much less morbid and is a very factual statement with no connotation of death, crashing or anything horrible. I don't remember either being aware of the incident a year earlier, let alone being worried about it. Maybe I'm wrong. And if I'd visited a psychologist, or is it psychiatrist, one of those thinky people anyway, they would say, yes, this is definitely the trigger of your flight phobia and is clearly the unconscious mind leading to the creation of an implicit attitude. Yeah, okay. Maybe they would be right. It is possible that my first flight could be linked with such a tragedy from the year before. Although, as there was no online news, no alerts, tweets, posts, or any social media, if you didn't watch the TV news, listen to the radio or read the paper, you were completely in the dark. Sounds like bliss, doesn't it? Anyway, back to the flight. The aircraft seating plan would have been 3 on each side of the aircraft with an aisle in the middle. My aisle seat was located on the left side of the aircraft and Darren's was an aisle seat on the right side. As far as I remember, the initial part of the flight was relatively unremarkable, but I know I didn't like the takeoff or turning in the climb out. I remember looking straight ahead towards the front of the aircraft and somehow knowing we were in a climb, but I had no understanding of how I knew that, as there were no reference points that I could see or relate to. Of course, after my flight training, I now know this is to be down to the inner ear's vestibular system. Just like a smartphone knows which way up it is, the ear can sense upwards or downwards, tilting left or right, or turning sideways. It's a clever thing, the ear. Back to the Corfu flight again. The rest of the flight was fairly uneventful until I heard the familiar and the no smoking signs. Yes, you could smoke on an aircraft in the 80s, and the seatbelt signs were illuminated. This was followed by the purser announcing that the captain has switched on the seatbelt and no smoking signs, as we are now making the start of our initial descent into Corfu International. Please could you ensure you return to your seat, which should be in the upright position, and your seatbelts are securely fastened until the signs are switched off. I can't remember if those were the exact words used, but I'm pretty sure it was something along those lines. Then the captain said, this is your captain, and we are currently making our initial descent into Corfu, and it is likely to be a little bumpy due to thunderstorms on the flight path into the airport. Please remain in your seat and ensure your seat belt is firmly fastened and your seat is in the upright position. Now suddenly, I'd gone from being completely oblivious to the flight to starting to get worried. Thunderstorms? Flight path? Die a horrible death? Well, maybe the last one is a bit much. I've seen the film Airplane, where some of the great aviation one-liners had originated from. Surely you can't be serious? I am serious, and don't call me Shirley. Captain, how soon can we land? I can't tell. You can tell me, I'm a doctor. A very funny film, and definitely worth a watch if you never have, even if it is a bit dated now. I started to think about the captain's words, the one on my plane, not from the film Airplane, and started to obsess over them. Then there was the sudden change in the engine noise as he started to throttle back. The plane started to drop and I could feel the changes around me as we quickly started to descend. And my anxiety level started to increase dramatically as I was suddenly aware I was in a little metal tube at 20-odd thousand feet and there was nothing I could do about it. It felt like we were diving towards the ground at hundreds of miles an hour. And whilst that was technically true, my irrational thoughts were magnifying the relatively safe descent into Corfu International Airport. Then, the turbulence started, which again I now know is a fairly normal part of the flight, especially as the plane starts its descent through the cloud layers. To add to this, the thunder and lightning started. I was now scared. I looked at Darren for some comfort and prodded him, but he was asleep. I then started the classic holding on to the seat as firmly as I could and creating that "look at me, I'm scared of flying" stance. The guy sat next to me said, "You scared of flying, mate? I do this every year, and it's always a bit bumpy coming into Corfu. Great place though, well worth it." I said I was, and he continued to tell me his life story, of which I cannot really remember very much. Anyway, the descent took what felt like 40 hours, but was more likely to be about 20 minutes. Turbulence, strange noises, flashing lights, and unnatural feelings continued until we were within a few miles of Corfu International Airport. I could see the guy to my left was watching me with amusement, occasionally turning to his partner and saying something clearly about me, and then laughing. I tried to look out the window, and all I could see was the sea, especially when the odd flash of lightning occurred. I was surprised to be able to see the sea, but not really much land. Then it hit me. We were going to land in the sea. It was obvious, and we were all going to die a horrible death of crashing and drowning. I think I may have even shouted this out a few times, still trying to wake Darren up. One interesting point about Corfu International Airport is that it has rather an unusual runway, the majority of which, especially if you look out of the left side, or should I say port side of the aircraft, is the sea. I remember left is port as it has the same number of letters as left. The nav light on that side of the aircraft is red, and I remember this as port, the alcoholic beverage, is also red. The runway is 2,373 metres long, so it's a good length. Not that I knew any of this at the time. The hysteria continued with the shaking and the up and down, then a horrifically loud noise as two jet engines spooled up to full power, and the driving towards the ground was suddenly arrested with me being exposed to what felt like someone standing on top of my shoulders, pushing me into my seat. The cabin went very quiet, and Mr. Frequent Flyer Know-It-All, who was previously making me feel stupid for being scared of flying for the latter part of this flight, said, "I don't like this, mate. It ain't normally like this." Bloody great, I thought. We are definitely all going to die now. I've not really had a proper girlfriend yet, or visited China or India. And Darren was still asleep. The captain then spoke up over the intercom and explained that he had executed something called a go-around, as the runway was flooded, so he was going to make another attempt. What? He only found this out on the actual landing phase of the flight? Thanks, ATC. I didn't really think that, as I didn't really know that at the time. He's having another go now. What's the worst that can happen? Oh yes, we're all going to die a horrible flame-engulfed, agonising, burny type of death. I realise now I'm sounding a little neurotic, but at the time, these were my very real thoughts. As the pilot executed a go-around, missed approach procedure, the noise of the flaps retracting and the gear ascending into the body of the aircraft added to the noise we were already enduring. Mr. Bighead remained quiet in his seat next to me, also now taking up that classic gripping the seat tightly stance. Oh, and Darren was still asleep. We continued to climb and then went through it all again, only for the pilot to execute yet another go-around. The captain announced that he was going to make one more attempt, and if this didn't work out, we would need to divert to Athens Airport. That sounded much safer. Stuff the holiday and living in Athens for the rest of my natural life would be completely acceptable. He did make another attempt, and we did land successfully and taxied to the terminal. Darren at last woke up saying, "Oh, that was a good flight, mate." I ignored him. We had a great holiday, and I cannot really remember anything about the flight home other than I would have been very scared. I do remember the flight well, and I think this very well may have been the catalyst for my flight phobia, as I seemed to relive the experience on every flight after that one. It also got worse. I worked at Gloucester Ski Centre and we went on group holidays to Andorra, flying to Toulouse, which is only a relatively short flight. I then met Karen and had numerous holidays to the Greek islands in the late 1990s. In 2001, Karen's boss, Kevin, took us up in a small plane after he gained his PPL. I watched the video the other day and he landed on runway 36 at Gloucester, the approach of which I am now very familiar with. I remember being petrified as soon as we took off and I wanted to land. I didn't have much to say on the video, which is unusual for me. I went on more holidays, and each time before we flew, I needed to do everything I could to stay calm, often purchasing over-the-counter calming medication. I even went to a local hypnotherapist, and that did actually make some difference, for a while at least. On one skiing holiday to America, I drank a fair few miniature bottles of whiskey on the flight. Nothing to be proud of at all, but it highlighted my state of mind whilst being trapped on a Boeing 757 for 5 hours. It may have been 7 hours. In 2013, whilst in a contract project manager role at a major UK mobile network, I was reacquainted with flying, as my boss had just got his PPL. He took me and the family up in a PA-28-161, call sign Golf Echo Kilo India Romeo. We flew from Cardiff Airport and up the Severn Estuary towards Gloucester. Now the plan was to fly over my house and take pictures. As we got within 10 miles of Gloucester, we encountered a cloud layer in front and about 1,000 feet below, so turned back to Cardiff. I was very glad of this, as I hated every minute of the flight. I felt so sorry for my boss, especially now as a pilot. I know he could see I was very scared and was not loving every minute of the flight as I should have been. We landed, and later that week we talked further about flying and how I should join Aero's flight training at Gloucester, which I did. More because I didn't want to let him down. And also, he signed my timesheets, rather than wanting to fly. Actually, that's not true. I really did want to learn to fly, but knew I would have to overcome the phobia somehow. We talked many times about my training, and he was so supportive and encouraged me to persevere with the training, especially as he knew how scared I was. The aircraft, Golf Echo Kilo India Romeo, was on loan from Gloucester Aeros to Cardiff Aeros when we flew up the Severn, and I did a lot of my training in the very same aircraft whilst at Gloucester. My first instructor, Jonathan, suffered my flying for 23 hours of training. On hour 10, he took me up through the clouds as I was ready to jack it all in. It was such a beautiful sight, and flying above the clouds at what felt like 50 feet made me think we were so close to the ground and not at 7,000 feet as we actually were. Jonathan got a job with an airline, so I started flying with Peter the week after. 4 hours of flying later, I did my first solo flight after 7 months of training on the 31st of August 2013. Peter got a job with an air freight company, so I stopped training for a good year or so, and then he offered to run some more lessons with me, before he went full-time with an airline in 2016. I then started flying with Blake, who was also my neighbour, at Freedom Aviation, based at Kemble, until he too got an airline job in 2018. I had a few more lessons at Freedom, then had a break until I moved to Bristol Aero Club in 2019, who are based at Gloucestershire Airport, which was much closer to where I lived. Kaz was the receptionist at my local chiropractor and was also a flight instructor at Bristol Aero Club. She introduced me to the club and finished off my PPL training, and I passed my PPL skill test on the 19th of October 2020. I also gained my night rating thanks to David on the 29th of December 2021. I have flown 160 hours and 15 minutes in total now. 29 hours and 50 minutes of that was solo, 6 hours and 54 minutes of that total has been night flying, and 5 hours and 25 minutes so far of instrument flying. People who know me say I am a control freak, and to be fair, they're probably right. I'm sure that I may be a little untrusting as well, and maybe those combined traits have been an influence on why the flight phobia has been a major part of my life. One positive is that if I can fly a plane, anyone can overcome any phobia. I am living proof of that. Thanks for watching, and if you like the video, please give it a thumbs up.